it took me a while not to lay a lot of shoulds on myself about I should be better at this. I should be better at moving toward my demons. I should be better at whatever it is, right? Brandon's work on self-acceptance, but also Buddhists, they all emphasize this message of easing up on myself, taking my foot off the accelerator of that critic inside myself.
Welcome to Emotional Sobriety.
How's everybody doing?
Well, first of all, is this the first show of the year or is this our second one, Patrick?
First of 2023. Welcome,
First
everybody.
one.
Look at that, everybody.
Happy New Year.
New Year.
Have you ever been on our podcast?
No, I have not.
That's so amazing to me because we've had so much discussion through our Thursday group and you know that I know you so well from these discussions. But it was occurring to me this morning, I don't think you've ever been on the podcast. So welcome.
Thank you, and I very much appreciate the invitation. I had a couple health issues in the past year that not because you guys haven't extended the invitation, but I haven't been able to accept it. But now I am, and very glad to be here.
You're somebody I love very much, and I have. And if we're gonna define meeting as being in the same room together, I've never met you.
And I have laughed. I've laughed so many times, Tom, at the text messages and the emails and so on that you have sent me, and know I have many more to look forward to, man. Thank you for that. Thank you.
Well, you're absolutely welcome.
Roger, can I start by asking, how do you come by this work? Tell us a bit about yourself.
I read a book during my undergraduate years back in Indiana, of all places, about 1969 or 1970, a book called The Psychology of Self-Esteem by a psychologist and self-esteem theorist named Nathaniel Branden. And that book had a big effect on me. I struggled a lot with self-criticism. I struggled a lot with perfectionism. And I'd never read about the topic of self-esteem before, and its importance to our happiness, its importance to our life. And in fact, that book had such a big effect on me that I decided to move to California and undertake personal psychotherapy for me with Nathaniel, which is what I did in 1972. And
wow, that's I've heard you say that before. That's huge, though. I mean that's we talk so much in recovery about willingness. I mean, there's a wonderful piece of willingness there, Roger. I mean, you find somebody that you believe you can learn something from, that you feel like you feel drawn to in that way, and you move across the fucking country to do that.
Keep in mind, I was going from Indiana to California, and I'd had a lot of thoughts about living in California. And
you're thinking if you were in California and Brandon was in Indiana, you might not have gone.
Might have given it a second thought, but I would have probably still done it. You make a good point. I appreciate that, Tom. I appreciate that, man. You make a good point.
All right.
So I packed up my bags and headed for LA, and most of the time I've been here ever since 1972. Did 2 or 3 years of group psychotherapy with him and participated in a informal training seminar he had. And then in the 1980s, I went back and worked with him for a couple more years. So it was my own deficiency of self-esteem, Patrick, that prompted me, as well as the possibility of improving my self-esteem that led me to that. And then through Nathaniel, I met a man, a PhD psychologist named Chuck Kelly, and Chuck did a kind of work with people called body-oriented work. Now, I would call it therapy, but Chuck didn't look at it that way. The humanistic psychology movement and the personal growth movement was real big in the early and mid 70s. And Chuck looked at all the work he did as personal growth work, as experiential education, rather than, as the medical model would say, as psychotherapy. And I really bought into that model and have used it for most of my work over the last almost 50 years now. But I took a couple workshops from Chuck Kelly about using breathing and movement and so on to access emotions. And I was blown away by my obliviousness to all the feelings that were jammed up inside of me. Anger, sadness, fear. And that made such an impression on me that I did a 2-year training program that Chuck offered in what he called radix work, body-oriented emotional release work. And for 15 or 18 years, that was the primary work that I did. But self-esteem work has always been a central part of the work I've done on myself and the work I've done with my clients. So that's a long-winded answer to your question, Patrick.
I think it's a very concise answer considering all that might include and experiential education. I've just, I just have adopted that forever for me right now. I'm so much more impressed with calling what we do that than anything that's really more related to a medical model. But, I just want to say before, and I know Allen has known you much longer than I have, and you guys have been working together for years. So I'm the newcomer to this group of relationships, but you're such a, and I've listened to you talk about this, and this is my impression of you anyway. You are such a willing student. You are, you and I bat around the idea of humility a lot, and it's like, I think we kind of talk to even notice each other's in that. In fact, probably we're arrogant about our humility. You and I, you have a very good instinct about what it is that fits for you, and when you go with it, man, you go all in. I love that. I love that about your story.
Thank you, Tom. I think that's true as I reflect on it, as I hear. First of all, I got a little chill when you said that. I really do appreciate those words, because I do. You know what it is? It's just curiosity, Tom, and it's about what resonates for me. And I think this is what it's about for most of us as people. Yeah. It's about what speaks to me, right? It's about, and I could see and still see at age 73, I think, 73, still see the ways in which my self-centeredness, as psychologists would say, which I'm not one of, my narcissistic tendencies harm me, harm other people. And out of that awareness of harm and pain that I've caused myself and caused others, the theme of humility, and I know it's a big theme for you and for Allen as well, has been uppermost in my mind for decades. And so it's led me to look a lot into Buddhism and other spiritual approaches to growth. But it's come out of an awareness of I'm just curious to learn. I'm curious to know things, right? And especially know things that will help people, things that will help people feel less conflicted, be in less pain, and feel happier in their lives. So, but I do appreciate you saying that, because I do think that's true, man.
We move towards our demons is what I hear you talking about. I have a sign on my wall. One of my little nutshells says, "Move towards your demons. They take their power from your retreat."
I live by it very imperfectly. I still avoid and evade and distract and deflect and, all that stuff. And so I don't want to convey an impression to you guys or to our listeners that's an all or nothing path. It's like self-esteem. It's like emotional sobriety. Some days are better than others, right? Some areas of my life are better than others. So I just want to convey that message to everyone, that the less evading and avoiding and denial I engage in, the better for me and for those I'm in relationship with, right? The more my self-esteem grows, the better I feel about myself. But that's not to say it's easy. That's not to say it's simple, right? The desire to avoid pain is a pretty deeply ingrained, or discomfort is a pretty deeply ingrained desire for me and for other people I know. So that's where self-acceptance and the big focus on self-acceptance comes from for me. Is it took me a while not to lay a lot of shoulds on myself about I should be better at this. I should be better at moving toward my demons. I should be better at whatever it is, right? Brandon's work on self-acceptance, but also Buddhists, they all emphasize this message of easing up on myself, taking my foot off the accelerator of that critic inside myself. That's another big piece of it for me. Yeah.
At the head, can I just ask, and this question goes to any and all of you, how does emotional sobriety and self-esteem fit together? How do you describe that?
Well, but I think let's do that in a second, Patrick. I was going to ask Roger, would you define self-esteem as you see it, Raj? Because there's a lot of people that don't understand that concept and they confuse it with self-concept.
In simplest terms, Alan, my self-esteem is how I feel about myself, right? I mean, in the simplest possible terms, it's how I feel about myself. And again, as I was saying a minute ago, that varies from period to period in my life. That varies from period to period in my day at a very superficial level, right? It varies according to which area of my life I'm functioning in, at work or at play or in relationship. But fundamentally, self-esteem, most simply put, is how do I feel about myself? Do I like myself most of the time? Am I on my side most of the time in my life? Or more often than not, am I against myself? Am I critical of myself? And am I disliking who I am? My mentor, who I mentioned, his formal definition was something like, and that's Nathaniel Brandon again, was something like, self-esteem is the disposition to experience oneself as competent to deal with the basic challenges of life. And that means paying the rent, right? That means communicating with my spouse. That means finding work and being able to show up at work. That means, being able to figure out what's important to me and what's not. And the second part is, and as being worthy of happiness. So that's where the self-respect and the self-worth piece comes in. And I relate to that, but for me personally, honestly, I like to keep it simple. The idea of how I feel about myself is what I operate from most of the day. And the piece that does speak to me a lot is the self-respect piece. Is this decision I'm about to make, or is this choice I'm about to make, is it going to raise my sense of self-respect, or is it going to diminish my sense of self-respect? So we talk about self-esteem as being the evaluative component of our self-concept. And what's self-concept? Well, that's my thoughts and my images of who I am, right? It's my physical characteristics, it's my behavioral characteristics, it's my psychological and emotional characteristics. Self-concept is just what it says. It's my idea. If it's an image, I call that in my head, I call that my self-image. If it's in words in my head, a verbal description, I call that my self-concept. And self-esteem is the evaluative component of that.
As you were talking, I just was realizing that self-esteem really, there's two components to it, or two elements to it, or experiences to it. One is a baseline, how I feel about myself in general, right?
Yeah.
Right.
And then what you were talking, Raj, day by day or moment by moment, I can either rise above that baseline or fall well below it. But it seems like there is a state that goes across time in the situations, and which is an interesting thing, because even if somebody feels good about one particular thing that they've just done, there has to be some work to integrate that to change your self-esteem.
Absolutely, Alan. Yeah, absolutely. And I agree with you. I do have a sense, but it's the same with personality, right? It's the same with emotional sobriety. It's not all or nothing. It's not the same all the time. No. And fortunately for us, the areas we're unhappy about with them, we can improve them, right? We can change them. A lot of that, as you and I talk about a lot, and Tom, comes about through extending a lot more acceptance toward ourselves in the way that we are, rather than judgment and criticalness toward that. Yeah. But I agree, there is a kind of what we could call a baseline level of my sense of self-worth, self-respect, and self-confidence. And it varies. It's not black and white. It's not all or nothing. Please don't demand of yourself that you feel great about yourself all the time. As Tom just said, a lot of our most important learning and growth is going to come from the areas we don't feel good about.
It runs right down the center of us. And each day is about how congruent we can be with that it really involves value system, right? It being and that begins with understanding what our value system is. And a lot of people, what I've discovered is when you talk about, because one of the best ways I know how to get in touch with who we are, and which is very much associated with emotional sobriety and self-esteem, is to ask the question that we've been trained away from in our culture, which is, what do I want? Because we've been taught, oh, that's selfish, that's a bad thing. It's like, no, it's not. What you want, it'll tell you so much about who you are. And if you can go toward that, and the more clear we are on what is important to us, because that's what that question is, what's important to you, the more congruent we live with that, live to that each day, determines our level of success. And like what you've set the stage very well for us today, Roger, with the idea of, and by the way, I want to make it clear for everybody here, no, not one of us have ever thought you were perfect. I promise.
No.
It never has occurred to me once. It's like, and I trust the same from you. It's like, but the idea of trying to, it's that breath counting meditation analogy. It's like, I'm going to lose my place in my breath count, and I got to come back and re-engage and reconnect. Pain is a tremendous motivator, like you say. It'll move us toward the things that we need, but it also that pain also is a motivator and a fuel for our defenses. So there's that battle to be had in our minds.
Exactly. I love your emphasis on values. Tom, because that's what I go to over and over again, sometimes consciously, sometimes looking back, it's more subconscious or unconscious, but that's the guiding point, right? You talk about what's important. I think the way I think of it often is what's important. I also think about what matters to me and what has meaning for me, what's meaningful for me and what's not. Those questions, what do I value? What's important to me, what matters to me, what's meaningful to me. Those are all questions that keep me on course, right? That keep me on course in my decision making and in the words I choose. A big part of emotional sobriety, and Patrick had asked us to talk about the connection. Allen, you say it very well in your books, that emotional sobriety involves our relationship to our emotions, right? To the fact that we want to be aware of our feelings and able to experience them and express them. But as you talk about it, not give our emotions privilege, right? Not let our emotions be the decision makers primarily in our lives. And that's what I think it's about. Oftentimes we need, and that's where consulting my values and what's important and what matters most, that's what helps me connect to the part of myself that's not going to let my feelings entirely run my life at certain points, whether it's my resentment or my anxiety. And believe me, I have grappled and still at times grapple with all of those feelings in my life. The focus on values and meaning is very important. I think, Tom, very important.
Well, even the very beginning of that point, it just occurs to me as we were talking, that is a challenge of self-esteem, or would, and today I'm doing pretty well, but it's like, certainly I think back in my recovery path, it's like I would have been a major challenge that I wouldn't even have recognized. And that is even to acknowledge that what I want, what somebody asked me the question, what matters to you most, even to be able to formulate that and state that with some confidence, basically requires some self-esteem. Because it says because then we got to challenge. The big question is, do I matter? Because how many people we work with, we go down that ladder, just a few rungs, it's like, I don't matter.
Right. I don't deserve this. I don't count. I don't matter. And a lot of us, to me, all of us grew up feeling that way about certain areas of our lives, right? Depending on our family of origin experiences. And I don't believe we're locked into those experiences, but lately I've been on this thing with my clients of, it couldn't be the case that almost all of us are left with really significant unresolved issues from our childhoods. if it was an accident. Okay. It's
Right.
like almost all of us are left with really powerful, really strong, I'll be kind and say unhelpful patterns of thinking and feeling and behaving. A stronger way to put it would be really limiting or damaging or even destructive, right? Patterns of thinking and feeling. So it's like one of the things that leads me toward in my thinking is, God, what if a large part of the purpose of my life as an adult is just to work as much of that stuff out as possible, not perfectly ever. I view it as layers of an onion, right? I never quote get there in terms of anytime I think I'm done with something, life has a way of showing me I'm not. Often quite soon after I
No
think I'm
shit.
done.
Don't
After I think
never
I'm
never
done with
dust
it.
off. Yeah, never dust off your hands, man. It's
But
like
that go ahead. But that doesn't mean progress is not possible. And it
no.
doesn't mean it doesn't make a huge difference in the quality of my life as I make progress, because it does. And you mentioned the importance of being able to be aware of what I want and express what I want. And so many of us don't feel okay about doing that, Tom. We don't feel we have a right. We feel we're being too selfish. Our Judeo-Christian ethic in this country can play into that. And I don't see it that way. Because, see, the piece that's left out of that is part of what I want is for you to be happy.
Yes.
Part of what I want is for Allen to be happy. Part of what I want is for people I love and people I don't even know to have as good a life as they can be having. And that's something that's selfish to me. I want those things for myself as well. But who I am includes my relationship with you, includes my relationship with Allen. And so to me, they're all pieces of the same pot, all in the same pot, you know? I don't like to artificially separate those things out. And yeah, sometimes the emphasis needs to be more on what I want at a certain point or moment in my life. Sometimes it may need to be more on what you want. But to me, if I come from a position, Alan talks a lot about Eric Fromm, and that relationships involve union with the preservation of integrity, is what Fromm said. And what he meant by that is connection, but a connection in which I stay true to me, right? With the preservation of integrity. And I think that is a beautifully concise way of saying it. That, and Alan talks a lot about it in terms of differentiation as well. But that I want to be deeply connected to you, but I also want to be deeply connected to myself. And almost always in my experience, there is a path to both. There is a path to working out conflicts, to working out differences, to working out disagreements, that can happen. Union, connection, cooperation with the preservation of autonomy, integrity.
Right.
I thought I'd throw it out there. Are you a 12-step guy, Roger? Are you in recovery or?
Actually, no, I'm not. I've primarily, through my long time association with Alan and others, but primarily with Alan, probably, at least half of my clients over the decades have been people who are in recovery. I do and have worked and currently work in treatment programs, doing groups and so on. But I am not personally in recovery. And it's something when I meet with clients individually or my groups at the treatment program I work with, it's something I mention at the beginning of my groups, because I've been aware my entire career that while obviously I do feel I have something of value to offer my clients who are in recovery or clients who are in treatment programs, it's not the same as having lived that experience. In fact, the way I put it to clients is, at an experiential level, you know way more about addiction and about recovery than I do at an
Well,
experiential
You don't have the
level.
basis for experiential empathy. You have empathy from other ways, but not from that. And by the way, I want to make this point real clear that how long have you known Alan?
Since 1979, I believe. Al, is that
Listen,
right?
it's to your credit that has not driven you to drink.
I've been saving him a seat for that very reason.
Oh, God.
I made Roger an honorary member of AA many years ago.
There you
So
go.
there's a
Thank
seat
you.
for
Tom,
him. There's a
I-
seat for him.
I gotta say, man, you have no idea how true that is.
That is
Okay?
true.
You
He
have
has no idea.
But here I have had conversations with Alan in person and countless more in my mind around that very theme, Tom. But here's the thing I'm always aware of. It's amazing in all those years that I haven't driven Alan to drink too. Right, Al?
Testimony to my recovery. See,
Right, Al?
it's
And I'm not-
reciprocal.
I'm not blowing
it's
smoke
true.
because Alan's tendencies and my tendencies as people, as personalities, very often conflict with each other. The fact we've been able to work with each other as much as we have and struggle, and I mean freaking struggle from both sides, his and mine, to do that union with integrity thing.
It's like a good marriage is what you're describing, is the idea that sometimes I'll tell couples I'm working with that are, I'll say, look, if from what I can tell, the problem definition is that you love each other, because if you didn't, the math on this would be very easy. You guys should never be in the same place ever together. It's like because it's just too messed up. It's too much to work through. But sometimes there is a connection that is so much deeper and so much more valid. And in y'all's case, by the way, I just want to say this for everybody who's ever benefited from each of you and both of you, that thank goodness for that, because that's a collaboration that, we all have our own ripple effect, but the two of you have a ripple effect also, a combined ripple effect that has benefited so many people and will continue to do that. And that's because you're willing to work that stuff out. And I love collaborations like that. I think some days you don't want to ever be back there again, but it's like in the bigger picture, you kind of just hold on to this thing as like, this is wonderful. And to be included to the degree that I've been included in your all's connection continues to be an honor to me. I just want to say that. So
Well,
our relationship is longer than any of our marriages.
yeah.
I mean, we've been together through several divorces with each other, and it
is a marriage. It's like
the other thing about this that I would say, and this is a result of what I think is a healthy relationship too, is I have grown considerably through the years. I'm a much better therapist because of Roger.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he brought in a focus and an understanding and a presence that was all along. He was so much more focused on the relational dynamic or component of psychotherapy than I was. I think I've caught up with him recently, but that he brought that to me, and the body work that I witnessed you do, Raj. I mean, to me, you were one of the most prominent body oriented therapists. You had such a gift to be with people and to be present with their pain and suffering, and how strong your empathy was. And you created such a safe container. I mean, all that stuff, I have learned a tremendous amount through the years. I'm a much better psychotherapist as well as a better person as a result of it.
And speaking of that body work, isn't that amazing? My wife and I used to work together before we decided we would get divorced if we kept doing it. But it's like, and she's very body focused, and it's like, to me, it's like, as a magician, I always say it's like watching a good magic trick, because it's like, and I bet you can identify with this. Dee Dee would start working with somebody, and I would go like, I don't know, what is she talking about? What is she doing? And then in a moment later, she asked somebody just the simplest question, or ask them to put their body in a particular position. And all of a sudden everything is there. And it's like, it's so impressive.
You know, I want to go back to something you said earlier, Tom, because I've given this a second thought. Because I
Mhm.
used to say exactly what you said. It's about the work is inside out, right? But I think it goes both ways.
Okay.
See, I think that also when you focus on dealing with a relationship and learning in that relationship, it helps you change your relationship with yourself.
Oh, absolutely. Yes,
It's
you're right.
it's
You're right.
isomorphic. See, I
Yeah.
think that
Yep.
that when instead of dividing it up like this, it's like the body mind discussion, the
You're
myth that
right.
they're separate. They're not separate. I mean, they are the same. They're all a part of a whole, right? So that if we think of it this way, if I, because I see that with Roger, there's been things in our relationship that he's confronted me with and that I took a look at, and it changed my relationship with myself. It helped me
Yeah.
look at myself in a different way. And I think vice versa. I
Yeah.
think the
Yeah.
same thing happened with Rod. So I think that change, and this is the exciting thing about it, is change is a result of our relationship to the experience we're having, whether it's with ourselves or someone else. It's the relationship we're having with that experience. Am I curious? Am I open? Am I willing to be authentic and honest about how this is impacting me and
Yes.
curious about it, right? I mean,
Mhm.
all of those things can lead to more and more awareness. As my awareness grows, now I become more aware of who I'm not rather than who I am.
Right.
But then that opens the door to experiment with now trying some things on differently. And, you even said it once. I loved when you said one time is that learning goes through those phases of you start out unconsciously incompetent, then you become aware of how incompetent or ignorant
Yeah.
you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you start to consciously focus on acquiring some new skills, new capacity, new awareness. And then if you stay grounded in that, it becomes an unconscious competence. And that's kind of the arc of psychotherapy, isn't it? It's the
Yeah.
arc of emotional sobriety. It's the arc of the
Right.
12-step work.
And it's the arc of learning. It's
the
it's
arc
learning.
of learning. See, I think, Fritz Perls said this, and I always appreciate it. He says, learning is about the discovery of new possibilities.
Mhm.
And I thought that was a wonderful, simple way of describing it.
That's beautiful.
And that's what we experience emotional sobriety is. It's just a great, construct to look at our life through, to understand our reactions and to use to help us on that path of our growth.
Well, what you're doing with that right now for me is you're doing the called the pan back, so that you pan back and see the bigger, just go another level back and get the bigger picture. And so when you say, okay, here's another one where we don't maybe have to make the division, that's really just a matter of language of inside out or outside in. You're talking more holistically. I mean, you bring to mind listening to Alan Watts, who's one of my favorite people to I like reading him, but I like listening to he has so many lectures online. I love listening to him because I just not only understand some things, but I feel that wholeness that you're describing.
I think one of the things that the Gestalt psychologists, I'm not talking about the therapists now, but the Gestalt psychologists saw is that we always want things to get completed, right? There's this movement towards completion because, see, I understood that as always a drive towards wholeness, right? We want things to fit together to make sense. And so it makes sense to me that within me is that force that's moving me in that direction through our whole life. You talked about it, when we talk about, some people think of a concept as God as a universal Christ, meaning that we're moving towards this wholeness, right? Christ is not just the embodiment of Jesus Christ that showed up, but there's a universal Christ that Father Richard Rohr, a theologist that I just love his work. But this movement towards this wholeness, towards this holiness, some people call it. It's so powerful, man. I see it in my life. I see that's the force that gets unleashed with people coming to recovery. They now start to move towards actualizing their potential, towards moving towards wholeness, towards becoming what they can be. it's so, look, it's kept me as excited about this business that we're in and this whole field of study, for now, what, almost, over 5 decades.
Mhm.
Well, Roger, when you talked about the preservation of integrity, for me, the physical sobriety and the working of the steps kind of acquainted me or reacquainted me with what my integrity is. And now that I've done that bit of work, listening to guys like you and learning about emotional sobriety and getting in touch with my emotions, I consider that the next leg of recovery, which I'm sure will take me through the rest of my life.
Well, it is. All of these are lifelong projects. Looking at my self-esteem, trying to grow my emotional sobriety, they're all lifelong projects. I wanted to add to what Allen said. Another word we use for that wholeness or holiness is what? Integrity.
That's right.
Yes.
Right. That's another word that we use for that kind of wholeness, that we have a deeply ingrained intrinsic drive toward. And that's one of the Brandon talks about 6 pillars of self-esteem. Functioning with integrity is one of those 6 pillars, right?
Sure is.
One of those 6 pillars. So I appreciate you saying that, Patrick, because that it's so true. These concepts, whether it's self-esteem or even emotional sobriety, from my point of view, they're applicable to people in recovery who are struggling with addiction and recovery from addiction. They're equally applicable to people who are struggling in other areas of their life unrelated to problems with addiction and recovery from addiction. And that's just the model that I use. That's why I like the personal growth model so much, because you just keep learning. You just keep learning, right?
Let me say this about that, because one of the things I've said, this goes to the bigger picture of emotional sobriety. I've said for years, what do people do who aren't fucked up like I am? What do people do who aren't alcoholics? How do they learn shit? And of course, there's Al-Anon and those things. My addiction was not to alcohol. Ultimately, it's addiction to believing and obeying what that little voice told me.
Yeah.
We all have that. It can be about something else entirely than the substance, but we're all addicts.
My addiction, much of my life, and Allen can deeply attest to this. I mean, let me give a personal example with regard to the self-esteem piece and tying it to emotional sobriety. I was raised in, I lived in rural Indiana, lived on a farm till I was 8, and we moved into the thriving metropolis of 1,000 people when I was about 8 until I was 17, right? And my dad was the principal of the school that I went to in this small town. And my mom literally told us kids more than once, remember, other kids in this community are looking to you kids to be models about how to behave, about how to act. And my mom was not an ogre. She was a sweetheart of a human being, one of the most loving, giving, consistently loving and giving human beings I've ever known, maybe the most that I've ever known personally. But she was very concerned about what other people thought of her, right? And so she instilled that. My older brother was the defiant member of the family, so he acted out. He held on to his anger. But the other 3 of us, more than not, went the compliant direction, right? The cooperative direction. And so I have had an incredible amount of work to do, identifying what could be called my codependent tendencies, my tendencies to put other people before myself, still working on that every day. It's had some very positive aspects. I tend to care a lot about other people. I tend to be tuned into feelings a lot, because that's what you do if you're concerned about not only what other people think of me, but how to help them, how to be a value to them. And so I've had an incredible amount of work, and it was interesting. Nathaniel did very little work with people explicitly on self-esteem. Now, if you read his books, like the 6 pillars of self-esteem or honoring the self, especially the 6 pillars of self-esteem and how to raise your self-esteem, they're filled with incomplete sentence exercises that look specifically at self-esteem and the pillars of self-esteem. But in his therapy, people work with people, including me, self-esteem was almost never talked about. He would just work with people on whatever issues were of concern to them in a way that helped them develop their self-esteem, right? That's the key piece. So I would do a lot of work on what the payoffs were for me about being so focused on other people, what the payoffs were for me about putting myself last, right, rather than first, and at times putting myself first. So, and emotional sobriety has a lot to say about that, about encouraging me to include myself, is how I think of it. Not exclusively, but to include myself in my life, in what matters to me, to include my wants, the word you used a while ago, Tom, in my life more. Still a process, still very much in process with all of that, but that's part of this puzzle, is realizing that we all have personal issues we struggle with, and we can look at them all as patterns of addiction. Addicted to certain ways of thinking, addicted to certain ways of feeling, addicted to certain behaviors. So I like that slant on it, Tom. Thank you.
Okay, here we've done this before, guys. I want to nominate that as a subject matter for another podcast, and invite Roger to come do this with us, because I think that by itself is a wonder. I mean, I think it's an ongoing subject for all of us, but I think it's really deserves some focus because it takes people to practical application.
Well, that's the thing. It does it right away. Like I say, Nathaniel wouldn't lecture. He wouldn't lecture people. His entire therapy approach was about, he would do a lot of incomplete sentence stems, giving them to people, like right now I'm feeling, or the good thing about putting myself last is, or the way I benefit from minimizing my importance is, on and on and on. But there was never a doubt the client's the one doing the work, right? And it's not. So I would be up for that. I would appreciate it and enjoy that.
What you're describing is a therapist who doesn't sell therapy off the rack. You know, it's like it's always it's Carl. I'm not quoting him precisely, probably, but Carl Jung talked about before each client he would try to forget everything he knew.
Well, that's my goal, as it is with you and with Allen. I know that from experiencing you guys, and especially Allen over so many decades. I'm aware of a part of myself that wants to tie the emotional sobriety piece in more right now, as I'm sitting here with you guys, to the self-esteem piece, and I think that, and as we've commented frequently, because in the Thursday night meeting that Allen created, and that you and I, Tom, are discussing that along with Herb Kagan. We talk about the commonalities a lot between self-esteem and emotional sobriety. And to me, there have to be a lot of commonalities, because they're both concerned with growing ourselves up, right? Fundamentally, they're both concerned with emotional, psychological maturation, and to some extent, spiritual maturation, I think, as well. Not that any of us, to me, ever become authorities about that, or we're all in process, to me, with all of that all the time. But that, to me, it's hard to say that about anything that it would raise our self-esteem, but it would damage our emotional sobriety, or with anything, with any behavior or way of thinking, or being less emotionally dependent, or our demands and expectations with regard to other people and all the problems those create for us in our life. It's hard to think of anything, for me at least, that I could talk about. Same with emotional sobriety. It's hard to talk about anything that would grow our emotional sobriety that would not also grow our sense of self-esteem, our sense of self-worth and self-confidence and self-respect, our sense of, am I worthy of love? Am I worthy of happiness? So to me, the two ideas of emotional sobriety and on the one hand and self-esteem on the other are deeply integrated. Nathaniel had this idea of reciprocal causation, that the more things we do that build our self-esteem and the higher our self-esteem becomes, the more things we do that build our self-esteem, right? It's a cycle, right? Or a spiral, if you want to look at it that way. And it's the same to me with self-esteem and emotional sobriety.
Yes.
As I grow in self-responsibility is a great example. Self-acceptance, living consciously. Those are 3 of Brandon's 6 pillars of self-esteem. The others are self-assertiveness and living with integrity and living with purpose, right? Finding a way to live life that's more meaningful, more purposeful to me. Every one of those practices of self-esteem, and the one that Herb Kagan added that Brandon also talked about, they all involve willingness, right? In fact, they need to involve willingness to practice these principles and to practice these concepts, to put them into motion, into our behavior in order for growth to happen. They have a reciprocal effect on one another. Different focus, sometimes different terminology, but to a large extent, we're talking about the same process, the process of growing ourselves up. So I wanted to get that in right before.
I think it's so important, Roger. I was thinking along those same lines when you were raising a question about how emotional sobriety influences our self-esteem, and our self-esteem influences our emotional sobriety. It's really that synergistic relationship, right? As like you said, you improve when one side, it improves the other side. As that side improves, it improves your emotional sobriety. And so that's that real cool thing on how, we talk about these negative feedback loops and how people get into these downward spirals. But it's also true the other way. These things start to reinforce one another, and we start growing ourselves in some cool ways.
Well, that's what Tom said. The more I begin to realize that a lot of the messages I absorbed about myself growing up are just not true.
Yes.
And that I absorb them and believe them. So then they do become self-fulfilling prophecies to me. I do behave in ways that reinforce these negative things. But the more I begin to challenge those or look at them and reevaluate them, the more my sense of self-worth begins to grow. Well, the more my sense of self-worth begins to grow, the more able I become to express what I want, right? And the more I express what I want, and so on. It's that cycle that you were just talking about. But that's just one example of it. So, yeah.
That's beautiful.
Well, it's been wonderful having you on the show today, Raj.
I've enjoyed the heck out of it, guys. Thanks so much for the invite. I really do appreciate it. And I've had a wonderful time, as I hope has been apparent. So thank you.
Yeah,
Patrick,
and Roger,
how have we done, Patrick?
You've done wonderfully, and I just wanted to clear this up for our listeners. Roger, who's better at tennis, you or Allen?
As befits our history, when we first started, I had a lot more experience, as a tennis player than Allen did, and I was quite a bit better than Allen was. But Allen, being Allen, as those of you who know him well might imagine, he has worked on his tennis game and took lessons over a couple of decades and became a substantially better player than I have ever been. So that's been the progression of our tennis history. The last 20 years or so, I have not played. Allen continues to play a little bit at times and still enjoys it. But that's a great question. That's a great question, Patrick. Yeah.
Dr. Berger, care to comment?
Patrick, Roger has made many tennis professionals quite wealthy. I come off the court beat up by him, and I think Jeff Martinez was, when we were up at UC Davis, I think Jeff Martinez was up there teaching in the area, and I would go take lessons with Jeff. Jeff, he did it again. He said, "I'm going to beat you. You're not going to win another point." And I didn't win another point. And Jeff said, "Man, he gets into your head, doesn't he?" I say, "Oh God, he does." But not only did he get in my head, he had the ability to back it up. Patrick, his forehand was a thing of beauty. He could hit clean winners from almost any place on the court with that forehand. Now his backhand, if I could ever get it to his backhand, that was a little shaky. I could win him.
Very shaky. Very shaky.
I'll tell you, he was so damn fast because he's a great athlete. He could cover that whole court with his forehand.
Long ago and far away, guys. Long ago and far away. Ancient history. But thank you, Alan. Thank you. But remember that second part I said. Alan worked hard at his game and became, and still is, a really accomplished player.
Well, it's all a metaphor for life to me. That's what this whole thing is. I remember doing a workshop with Billie Jean King. We were speaking together down in San Diego to a bunch of juniors. And I love how she got up and says, look, you guys, you may not understand what this means now, but tennis is a metaphor for your life. How you're showing up here is how you show up in your life. What you do on the court is what you're going to do in your life. What your attitude is, how you approach this game is how you approach your life. I'm a big fan of hers, and she was so right on with that.
I can't show this to you guys. I'm looking at a picture of you and me, Alan, when we finished second in a tournament at Alta Vista. I still have that on the shelf, and I'm looking at it at this moment, man. So we were partners in our differences even then.
Tend your life, tend your myth, cultivate your narrative with whomever you're with. Then with glass in hand and children on one knee, bring some stories, bring your stories back to me. It ain't a crime to be a human. Never be ashamed to be yourself. Rest assured that whatever you're doing will entertain me like nobody else. So here's to us, my old friends, until it's time to drink the wine and break the bread again. With glass in hand and children on one knee, bring some stories, bring your stories back to me.